Hello everyone and welcome back to this week's video. This week we are looking at the motif of alcohol in an inspector calls. So first we'll start off by looking at what a motif is. Okay, there are motifs in every literature text that we study and we pick out certain motifs to explore in a little bit more detail. So a motif is a distinctive feature that recurs, so happens again and again, you see it again and again, within a piece of literature that has a symbolic meaning. So I've put our literature texts on the screen, and in Macbeth there are several recurring ideas that we can consider that are motifs. We look at the darkness versus the light, references to hands and references to blood. In A Christmas Carol, we look at the references to the weather, the references to fire/warmth, and the references to hands again. But with this one, it's a little bit different. It's not just talking about hands, it's more about the actions of hands. So in A Christmas Carol, you will find there's lots of verbs like twisting, pulling, pulled, wrenching, grasping, all of those sorts of verbs that link to sort of the physical action of hands. And then for today's video, we're going to look at an inspector calls, and that is the recurring idea of alcohol, but we could also look at the recurring idea of money that is referenced throughout that play as well. So we've established that in an inspector calls, Priestley uses the motif of alcohol, okay, and this is the idea that it's something that is recurring. Now in the play, there are 35 references specifically to the word drink in the play. Now this is no accident. Priestley is clearly using these references to represent something, but what is it? We can look at the references to alcohol and the references to drink to symbolise two things. First is this idea around control. Okay, so most references to alcohol are either accompanied by a command or accompanied by an attempt to command someone. The second strand we can look at is this idea of linking alcohol to corruption in society. So there are many references to alcohol in which Priestley is revealing the sordid underbelly of the aristocracy, okay, and the idea that the aristocracy and the upper classes are immoral. Okay, now we're going to track the use of alcohol in the play, and obviously we're going to start from the very beginning. Now, in the stage directions, there are references to drink glasses, i.e. champagne glasses and port glasses that Edna is sort of clearing away. But the first spoken line of the play is given by Mr. Berling, and I think it's really, really significant because he opens the play with giving us the poor Edna. Now, what Priestley is doing here is he's opening the play with Mr. Berling making a request from the only character who physically represents the working class on stage. So we can see the dynamic between Mr. Berling, who is in charge, in power, a prosperous manufacturer, sort of organising and commanding from the working class who are expected to serve those with more wealth. By using this command, Priestley is revealing Mr. Berling as a man who attempts to control the working class to do his bidding, okay? And we see that through Edna. But then we've got to investigate the port a little bit more, because it doesn't just stop there. The reference to port doesn't just finish with him asking for a glass of port. It is this idea that he's using the port in order to elevate his status around the table, especially in front of Gerald. So he says to Gerald, Finchley told me it's exactly the same port your father gets from him. So what Priestley is revealing here is that Mr. Berling has specifically sought out the same port that Gerald's father, Lord Croft purchases, and we could assume that this is Mr. Berling's attempt to ingratiate himself with Gerald. So this attempt to show Gerald that he is from a worthy family and he is a wealthy member of society, because he can access the same port that Lord Croft can access. Interestingly, we can see that this moment emphasises how actually Mr. Berling is socially inferior in position in comparison to Gerald. Okay, so that need and that desire to prove his wealth and to prove his status actually undermines him in the same way. So Mr. Berling is presented as a prosperous manufacturer, so he would not need to openly state that the port is the same. So ironically, with the motif of alcohol symbolising control, this is revealing that Mr. Berling actually lacks that control, and therefore, structurally, Priestley is subtly undermining Mr. Berling's impending speech about war and politics. This idea that Mr. Berling is unreliable, he is unworthy of our attention. Really significantly, it's not only Mr. Berling who talks about alcohol, okay? Every single character in the play actually references alcohol. Now, at the beginning, Sheila is sort of responding to her father's discussion around port, and she says to Gerald, I'd hate you to know all about port, like one of these purple-faced old men. Okay, and that reference to the purple-faced old men sort of really links closely to what we find out later about other corrupt members of society. So, predominantly Alderman Meggerty, who the Berling family know, and it reminds me of the description of him being an obscene fat carcass. So that sort of links with this purple-faced old man, somebody who's indulged far too much, okay, and benefits from their privilege and almost greediness. But Alderman Meggerty is a man who is supposed to represent authority and honesty. He works on the council, but instead the alcohol that causes these men to be purple-faced show that they are corrupted. Okay, now what Sheila doesn't realise, it's like the sense of irony here, that she's saying that she doesn't want Gerald to become one of those men without actually realising he already is one of those men, because he is a man who, like Alderman Meggerty, frequents the Palace Bar, which we know is associated with prostitution, okay, and alcohol. And it's this idea that Gerald has already embodied and is already following that path towards becoming, later in life, that purple-faced old man. He's the one who references the difference between hard-eyed, dough-faced women and the young and fresh in comparison to Eva. So there's a recognition that he's certainly very experienced at the Palace Bar, which therefore shows as corruption. And then we've got this irony as well of Sheila at the very beginning of the play is being used by Priestley to hint at the later corruption, which we are yet to be is yet to be revealed to us. And I also like to think about this idea of Sheila at the very beginning of the play has already said, I'd hate you to be one of these men, which shows that Priestley's using her to demonstrate Sheila's ability to denounce corruption later on in the play. So this ability that she's already the type of person who does not condone sort of this excessive drinking, excessive alcoholism. You can also look at this moment through the feminist lens, so thinking about how this links to the patriarchal ideology of living in separate spheres. So men have one sphere, women have another sphere. And this idea intensifies Sheila's ignorance towards the reality of how men actually behave in society because of this lack of understanding and awareness of who Gerald actually is, and the fact that she's engaged to him as well. This blindness that she is enshrouded in because of the corruption of society. Now, as I said before, there are every single character references alcohol in the play, and we've even got the inspector sort of discussing this with Mr. Berling. So Mr. Berling says, have a glass of port or a little whiskey, and the inspector replies, no thank you, Mr. Berling, I'm on duty. Now, Priestley's using Mr. Berling's character to show his attempt again to control a situation. So we know that the motif of alcohol represents ideas around control and ideas around corruption. And instead of politely asking the inspector if he'd like a drink, Priestley's using the command have to demonstrate that Mr. Berling is attempting to have authority and control over a police inspector. You've also got to think about this idea as well, that it shows that Mr. Berling is quite comfortable in offering men of power alcohol, or having men of power visit his house and visit his home. And it's this idea that he also talks about his friend who works for the police force, which intensifies how this interaction is almost normalised amongst men in power. Okay, you've got to think about, why is it that Mr. Berling is offering the inspector alcohol? Is it a way in which he asserts his dominance over the inspector, or is it a way of already almost admitting guilt from the get-go? Is he wanting the inspector to lower his inhibitions by drinking a glass, become friendly with Mr. Berling, and therefore attempt to escape any culpability as to why the inspector has come round to visit the family? And then we've got the stark contrast in reaction with the inspector. Okay, so Mr. Berling is the inspector's foil, because Priestley uses the inspector to reject Mr. Berling's attempt of any control. Okay, we can see the clear indication of moral superiority here. Mr. Berling, immoral, corrupt character who's attempting to use cronyism to get ahead, attempting to use cronyism to distance himself from any sort of culpability, whereas the inspector is pursuing the Berling family and ensuring that they are sort of listening to his message. I also like to think about analysing the use of the word duty. So we've got here the inspector rejecting immorality, rejecting alcohol, which represents control and corruption, and says that his duty is to ask questions. It's his duty to be interrogative towards the family, whereas Mr. Berling in the play claims that his duty is to keep labour costs down. So we've got the clear disparity between morality between Mr. Berling and the inspector. And then we can't talk about the motif of alcohol in the play without exploring Eric's character. We know from the get-go, Sheila describes Eric as being squiffy. We see that Eric is hardly without a drink in any of the scenes that he's in, or the moments he's in. And we've also got the really crude description of how he treated Eva when he describes himself being in a state when a chap easily turns nasty. So we see that Priestley's presenting Eric as a young man who is heavily reliant on alcohol. And there are interpretations for this. Why is it that Eric, who represents the younger generation, who is meant to be forging this new path to a morally superior society, why is it he then is depicted as an alcoholic? So I would talk about two avenues. So Eric is clearly a man who is uncomfortable with his environment. In the stage directions, he's described as being seated downstage, so he's away from his family. He's this idea of like the odd one out. He's also described as being half shy, half assertive. His character has not fully materialised, not fully formed. His attitudes have not become stagnant like his father and mother's. And he also questions his father's business motivations when he says things like, what about war? And he could have kept it on instead of throwing her out. So we can see this idea of Eric constantly fighting against the corruption of his father. So perhaps the motif of alcohol is symbolising Eric's desire to escape this corruption, to almost escape reality, because he's struggling so much because he does not fit in with his family. However, we can't then ignore how ironic this is, because Eric is attempting to escape the corruption, but that therefore leads him to embody the corruption himself by abusing Eva. Then the alternate interpretation would be, is Priestley using Eric's reliance of alcohol to reveal the extent in which privileged men abuse their power? And this idea, again, linking to Alderman Megati, this idea around wealthy men indulging excessively in their life. They don't have the same morals and the same sort of motivations that other people have. And you think about Alderman Megati in the Palace Bar, and Priestley is highlighting how society can be trapped in the cycle of entitlement and misogyny if intervention does not take place. So yes, Eric has committed a really sort of heinous act by forcing himself upon Eva. However, it is through the external influence of the inspector that forces Eric to reject this corruption, reject this control that's taking over him. And finally, if we're continuing along this avenue of motif of alcohol, then we've got to recognise that this structure is cyclical. The opening line of the play is when Mr. Berling says, "Give us the port, Edna," and at the end of the play, just before the second telephone rings to inform the family that there is actually an inspector on the way, Mr. Berling and the family are all, well, not the all family, Mr. Berling, Mrs. Berling and Gerald are celebratory. They feel relieved, they feel relaxed because they feel like they have been had, as Mr. Berling states. And he smiles at them all. "Have a drink, Gerald," and it's almost like he's raising this toast to continue their ignorance. And I think Priestley is using this cyclical structure with the motif of alcohol to achieve multiple things here. So the first thing is that it is obvious that Mr. Berling, who's representing the older generation, that their attitudes remain stagnant despite the external influence from somebody outside, okay, which is the inspector. And for an audience, this makes the immorality of Mr. and Mrs. Berling and Gerald even more heinous, okay, even more vulgar. Then you've also got this idea of the celebratory drink at the end, further intensifies the crude nature of the aristocracy, who reject their own morality and instead only focus on their escape from culpability and seemingly intact facade. So this idea that Mr. Berling thinks he has gotten away with treating a young woman, a member of the working class, really cruelly, okay? And it's this idea that he is celebrating the fact that he has escaped public persecution because he constantly references the press might easily take it up, there'll be a public scandal, so that is why he's relaxed and relieved. And then the last sort of thing that I think Priestley's attempting to achieve is that those who have been enlightened by the inspector, who are Sheila and Eric, they refuse to partake in the celebratory drink. We know that Sheila says, "It frightens me the way you talk." Eric then says, and I agree with Sheila, "It frightens me too," which Priestley is using these two characters to provide hope, because he viewed this generation, the younger generation, as being capable of forging a better, building a nobler society.